and welcome back to Ask the Expert on Tudors Dynasty podcast. I'm your host, Steph Storr, and I'm here today with the fabulous and brilliant author, Joanna Hickson. Hello, Joanna. Welcome.
Hello, all the way from England.
Yes. Welcome. I'm so happy that you're here with us today. And I am just bursting because I can already think of several topics I'd love to discuss in the future because you write just about such interesting things and people, and we'll get to all your books a little bit later. But today's, quote, character, for lack of a better word, right, is Joan. I don't know even how to say it. Vaux? Vaux? Do we say the X?
Vaux, and I call her Joan Vaux.
Okay,
I
Vaux.
think you're allowed to choose. I believe her brother, when he spoke of her after her, with other people, he called her Vance or something like that. I think there were lots of ways, as there are in many parts of history. Pronunciations, we don't really know what they were. So it doesn't matter.
It does, right? It doesn't. We all know who we're talking about, right? It's Vaux.
Yeah.
Say the X if you want to. Go for it.
Anyway,
right?
Most of history shows her as Joan Guilford, because that was her first husband.
Not many of our listeners are familiar with Joan, but I know they're going to love her by the end of this. So very quickly, before we get into the listener questions, can you tell us who was she? Where did she come from? Where did she grow up? Was she connected at court early on? And, what led her to become someone that we ultimately have this interest in?
Yes, she had quite an interesting childhood because her mother was an Italian called Catherine Penison, is how the English pronounce it, but I think it's Penisoni or Paniceni or something in Italian. However, she was born in over the Alps from where France is, but she actually ended up in France, and she was born in Corticello, Piedmont, which had been annexed by the Duke of Anjou, and so it was in fact a French territory, but officially she was French, but in fact she was Italian and spoke Italian. So when she eventually married and had her child actually in Corticello, that I will explain that later, but she was speaking Italian with her first child, her second child, who was Joan. Joan was born actually in Corticello, her mother's also birthplace, because her mother had to flee from England after the Battle of Towton when she and her husband fled because Edward the Fourth had won that battle, and Henry the Sixth and his wife were fleeing, and she fled to France, and he fled within England and was later caught and taken to the Tower. So that was the first rule starting of Edward the Fourth. And Joan was born at that time when her mother fled to her own family in Corticello and had her child, second child, because she'd already had a boy who was born in England, with her husband, whose name was Vaux. His name was Sir William Vaux. He was a knight, and he was a knight in the household of Queen Marguerite, as I called her, because there were too many Margarets in England at the time, and my book had to have clarity as to who was who. So since there was quite a lot of...
Right. There's so many Margarets and Elizabeths and Marys.
Yes.
And
so I called her Queen Marguerite all the way through. And she wanted to keep her French connections very, very safely. And I also have her call her son, when he's eventually born, not Edward, which he officially was in England, but Edouard in the French, because she wanted, Marguerite was French. So anyway, have I confused everybody totally by now?
No. I think that's great. But I just want to clarify one thing then. you mentioned them fleeing and them being somewhat connected to the Queen. Are we to assume that their family then was tied more to the Lancastrian cause
Yes.
than York? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So did their family have a relationship with the Queen, or they just kind of followed the Lancastrian?
No, the Queen was connected, well, obviously came from Anjou. And in Anjou, she had a doctor who was called Gregorio Corticelli. And he was somebody from Catherine, whose name was Penison, but she was also a Corticellan. So when she was born and Margaret was going to England, she was only a child, but he thought that she would be a good companion and lady, sort of in waiting, kind of. Not a lady, but probably more of a sort of servant, really, to come across to England. So when he came to England to serve Queen Marguerite, he brought this child that he knew who'd been in the same classroom as one of Marguerite's sisters. So there was a connection there. It was quite loose, but there was a connection before the marriage of Queen Marguerite to Henry VI.
One thing that I had been reading is that her birth name was not necessarily Joan as we see it, Joan. Can you clarify whether or not the name she was given at birth was actually Joan?
Well, I don't know precisely. I haven't seen it in historical research, but she was born in Corticello in Piedmont, and her mother was Vaux Italian, really, although it was a French sort of connection. So she was, I think, born as an Italian because they were living in there and they didn't know if they were ever going to go back to England at the time. So I think that she probably was called Giovanni after her mother's mother, so her grandmother. And I called her Giovanna for a short time in the book because I wanted to establish this Italian-French connection. But when she came to England with her mother, back to England, she was serving Queen Marguerite, and she was called Joan. So although she was christened, baptized Giovanna in Italy, she was not called Giovanna in England. They called her Joan because that's the equivalent, or Joanna, actually, which is my name. So, but she was called Joan, and I think it was possibly because she didn't look like the sort of average English rose. She was dark. I mean, she wasn't obviously black-skinned or anything like that, but she was quite dark of colouring and had lovely black hair. And this was not considered beautiful by the court lovelies who in England wanted to be blonde and sort of rosy-cheeked. So
that Mediterranean look that I have is not accepted by
that's
English court.
No, I don't think it was. But of course, it didn't really harm her in any way in the end because she turned out to be a rather prodigious child. She was a child prodigy, as they say. And there's lots of reasons for that. So I can go through that with, if you want, in some detail. Because she was made a ward of Lady Margaret Beaufort she was begged. Lady Margaret was begged by Catherine Vaux, that she should be made a ward of Lady Margaret Beaufort, who she had met obviously in the court of Queen Marguerite. And they were good friends. She and Catherine Vaux were very good friends. And so she asked her good friend, Lady Margaret Beaufort, if she would take her two children as wards. And this was when the Queen had fled to France and had asked her friend and servant, Catherine, to go with her. And Catherine, of course, did agree and had to leave her children in England. So she left them with Lady Margaret Beaufort. And this was actually, as it turned out, for Joan, the best thing for her, because in Lady Margaret's household, there were quite a few wards, and there was a lot of education. There were tutors, and there was a fantastic library. And Joan was a child prodigy in that way. She already spoke Italian and French. She was rapidly learning English, and she also spoke Latin. So there were very, very few women in England at that time who did anything more than speak English or some French, because French was sort of running out as a court language at this time. So she really blossomed in this atmosphere in Lady Margaret's house. And I think that was her doing, really. I mean, that's made her a very, very good court lady later.
That's so helpful, because I did have a question about how she ended up a ward of Margaret Beaufort. And I don't think that it's very clear necessarily that it was because her mother went away with Queen Marguerite. So that's very helpful.
She followed Queen Marguerite throughout her life. She was very, very close to Queen Marguerite, although she was younger than her. Marguerite relied on her a great deal, and she also went when Queen Marguerite was confined in the Tower of London by Edward IV. She begged that she should have her friend, who she called Kate, with her, because that was the one she wanted, and Kate couldn't refuse. And later, when she was actually taken back to France, because she was ransomed, and she went back to France, where she died shortly afterwards. And she begged again Kate to come with her, which she did. So she was there when Queen Marguerite died.
I realize that our conversation today is not necessarily supposed to focus on Margaret of Anjou, but I actually do find it very interesting. And I just want to point out here that it is nice to hear her have this friend, Kate, because I don't think that Margaret of Anjou is necessarily always portrayed as a loving, friendly, warm person in history.
I don't show her as that in the book. She's quite a difficult character, and Kate was quite, I think, was very decent to go with her. But her children and Joan in particular did chide her. In fact, I have her chiding her in the book, her own mother, for saying that you left us. Why did you leave us? And she just tells her, she said, well, you've got to realize that I did you a favor because you had this brilliant education, and it hasn't done you any harm. So that's a nice conversation that goes on in the book.
Oh, well, there you go. There's another reason to grab one of the books, at least, because we have two of them, right?
Yes,
two of them about Joan?
Yeah.
The Lady of the Ravens and the Queen's Lady. So let's talk about that then. Before we move on with Joan, we can, since we kind of mentioned the book.
Joan, really.
Right. So these are the two books about her, and they are available in the UK and the US.
That's right.
On Amazon, through HarperCollins, kind of wherever anybody can get the books. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed. Yes. So you can even get them on some things that you can order, online and get free delivery.
Okay. Perfect. There's our little commercial right in the middle there. Everybody grab the two books. So now, while Joan was under the care of Margaret Beaufort, at what point does she meet her husband, or soon to be husband? Does she get matched with him? Do they meet on their own? Do her parents have any involvement in their relationship, or is this something that Margaret Beaufort coordinates? What is the situation around her life when she does move on to get married?
Well, she first of all has to become the lady in waiting to Elizabeth of York. So, of course, that's all going to happen after the reign of Richard III and the Battle of Bosworth, which is when Henry VII stole the throne, if you like.
So, okay, let's go back to that then. Instead of talking about her marriage just yet, we can
until after that.
Okay. All right. So then we'll scrap the personal life for a second then and come back to that in a minute, because as you said, the Battle of Bosworth played a role in her, I guess, her occupation or her standing, because...
Well, the Battle of Bosworth was the one which put Henry VII on the throne, Henry Tudor, and the Tudor, this is the beginning, isn't it, of the official Tudor dynasty.
Depends on what country the person you're talking to is from.
Well,
right.
Everyone knows what I mean. Yes, so the Battle of Bosworth was, definitive in bringing the Tudor dynasty to the throne. And when Henry Tudor, exile in France and Brittany for 14 years, came and won that battle, he came straight to London and established that he would marry Princess Elizabeth of York, who was the daughter of Edward IV, the king, who had died before Richard III. So we're talking, kings are flying here and there in this period. And Joan isn't married. She's still single, and she's still living with Margaret Beaufort. And she's not really wanting to get married at all at this time. And there's no reason for her to do so. So when she becomes the servant to Elizabeth of York, that is organised by Margaret Beaufort and her son, who is now Henry VII. Because when he was in Brittany a couple of years before, he made a vow to marry the daughter of Edward IV, who was the sort of face of the York dynasty, obviously. And so he wanted to bring the Yorks and the Tudors together as a royal family. That was his intention, of course. And a lot of people in England believed that the Yorkists should still be on the throne. I mean, they didn't really want to accept this Tudor dynasty, and they didn't want to accept the fact that Richard III, well, now here I'm going to be controversial, had managed to get rid of Edward the Fifth and his brother Richard, who might have become king, or one of them would become king if he hadn't.
There it is. This is going to take everything in me to not keep going about this. But, well, right. Controversial is an understatement, but yes, proceed.
In America, we're quite happy in England about it.
Yeah, is that right?
So there we are. We've got Joan, and she is brought down from where she was living under Richard III. She was up in Yorkshire, and she's brought down to London by Henry. That's one of the first things he orders to happen. And she comes to Margaret Beaufort's house, Cold Harbour in London, and is installed there with this companion that Margaret provides for her, which happens to be Joan, who has been her ward for all this time. So that is how Joan became so close to Elizabeth of York.
So since she's working with or for Elizabeth of York, then she goes on to become a lady in waiting to her daughters as well.
No, she couldn't. She's a lady in waiting eventually to Elizabeth of York when she becomes queen, but she couldn't be a lady in waiting until she married, because this was to do with, court protocol, that single women were not ladies in waiting. They had to be a lady for a start. They could be single if they were the daughter of maybe a duke or an earl. But if they were, like Joan was, coming up from the sort of commoners, there was no way they could become a lady in waiting unless they married somebody who would make them a lady, i.e. a knight.
So this is where the marriage comes in.
This is where the marriage comes in. And Joan, of course, being incredibly intelligent and bright and realizing that marriage is a very dangerous thing to do because so many women died in childbirth, and she was very frightened of marriage. And so she didn't really want to get married. So it took a couple of years, actually, to persuade her that she must marry because... and the Queen persuaded her, Queen Elizabeth, because she wanted her to stay with her and she wanted her to be one of her ladies in waiting. So she and Henry, the King, organised the idea of her marrying this man, Sir Richard Guilford. Now, his wife had died the year before, and that he had 6 children. So, it wasn't that easy a sort of job for Joan to do. And Richard Guilford was the king's controller of ordnance, and he lived in the Tower of London. And this is what drew me to him, because in the Tower of London are the ravens, and I am extremely fond of the ravens. So I wanted to write about the ravens, really, when I wrote this book. That's why it's called The Lady of the Ravens. That's the first book. And so she became his wife, and she went to live at the Tower of London, where she also fell in love with the ravens. Why not? And that becomes a sort of theme in the book, which is kind of balancing the idea that the ravens are there to protect the tower, and if the ravens are not there, the tower will crumble and the throne will collapse. England will be in dire straits. So that's the myth. And
no pressure on the ravens or anything.
No, exactly.
That's very symbolic.
You have to have ravens there,
Yes,
a certain number, to preserve the English something or other. Anyway, it's a nice story. But so she marries him. But there is in the book I make a sort of problem for her, because A, she doesn't want to get married, and B, somebody else comes along and wants to marry her as well, and that somebody else is not a very nice knight. But at least he's a knight. So she's asked to make this choice between these 2 men, and she chooses Richard, even though he's got 6 children, and she doesn't know anything about bringing up children, or so that's what she does, and she makes a good fist of it. She really does. She tries very hard, and it's lovely. I mean, I like the nice pieces in the book about how she relates to the children and relates to marriage in general. It's not all about the kings and queens. A lot of this is about her and her husband, who also has to get used to her, and he's quite a lot older than her, having already got 6 children. So that's a nice theme in the book as well.
And it's a nice, it's a unique aspect, I think, of writing a historical fiction novel that is obviously about royalty, but being able to play on some of the themes that are not necessarily just kings and queens.
Yes, it's about people, and they're not all glamorous courtiers. And Joan, in a way, isn't a glamorous courtier. She's much too intelligent for that. She really does know how to relate to people and how to speak to people. And there's a lovely picture of her that was painted by one of the court painters of when she goes to be governess eventually to the children of the king in Eltham Palace. And she is holding little Edmund, who was one of the Queen's children who unfortunately died as a very young child. And she has Henry VIII to be in the he's in the picture, and it's all to entertain Erasmus, who was this incredibly intelligent guy who lived in Europe, all around Europe, but had visited England and wanted to meet the children of the king and managed to do so. And he got on very well with Henry, and also he registered Joan, and he had several long conversations with her and found her obviously not only very intelligent but very easy to talk to. And they had long conversations. I don't know what about, obviously, but and I didn't try to write their conversations. But it's a nice touch that this incredibly intelligent European immediately cottoned on to Joan as being something quite special.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth, because when you had mentioned her relationships earlier, that was something I wanted to make sure to ask you. Now, I don't necessarily know, I mean, maybe you can help us understand when they met each other, but isn't that an unlikely friendship? And it's just so interesting that if you read about Joan, if you start to try to do your own research, for the listeners out there who obviously are definitely going to look into her after this podcast episode, but when you read about her, Erasmus comes up a lot, having been a close friend of hers and having been very special to him.
Yes, but
how did that happen?
Well, she was actually obviously when he met her, she was of age to be a governess. I mean, she wasn't a child, she wasn't a young lady even by then. She was, she was still married to Sir Richard Guilford, but she was quite a fine woman, and she had her only child. She had born a child to Sir Richard, and her child, she had to come and go to all the time because she was the governess of these children of the king. Later on, after this occasion when Erasmus came to the palace of Eltham, he became a friend too of her son Henry. That was obviously when Henry had grown up and was in Henry VIII's household as a prince, and that was an interesting, because obviously Henry was brightly intelligent too, and there were too many Henrys around. It was terribly complicated.
Now, Joan is, as you said, she's a governess. She does eventually become lady in waiting to Margaret and Mary. Can you tell us a little bit about when Mary is sent to marry the King of France? Joan was sent with her, but then dismissed and then recalled again. And what's going on over there?
Well, Joan, I'd kind of like to say that Joan had some experience in handling marriages to young princesses, because she'd already been to Edinburgh, up to Edinburgh in Scotland, with Margaret, Princess Margaret, who was the older daughter of King Henry VII, and Joan went with her to this marriage, and it was quite an interesting one. That the reason I found it very interesting was because she went to take this princess to the King of Scotland, James IV, who was not married. He'd never been married, but he was already 32, and he had lots of female friends, obviously. And Margaret was going to have to cope with this, and Joan had to make it, and she was only 13. Joan had to try and explain to her, how she had to cope with this, how she could cope with this. And I found it very fascinating to write, actually, because I knew that, when you marry in any, at this time in history, you weren't considered to be married until the marriage had been consummated. And, her mother didn't want her young child to go. The Queen had not wanted her to go at this young age, but she had died. And King Henry, Princess Margaret's father, wanted her to be married to James IV to settle this treaty, which was a treaty of forevermore of peace between Scotland and England. I'm sorry, I'm doing a laugh here because it only lasted 2 years. So, and then there was,
forevermore, or
yes,
until the next argument.
Until the next time there's a war. Anyway, she had to explain, all about what she should do after the wedding, and the king as well. She had to handle him because she had promised Queen Elizabeth that her daughter would not have the marriage consummated, and she had made her husband, the king, agree to say that he didn't want it to happen, but he changed his mind after she died, very conveniently, and he said that it did have to be, and James also wanted it to be consummated, and I don't think it was because he couldn't resist having sex with a 13-year-old. I think it was because, he knew the same thing. So he wanted it to do, and I found a way of explaining it to Margaret that it had to happen, but that she wouldn't then be approached for another 2 years. And it was quite difficult to write because Margaret wasn't stupid.
I can hardly imagine.
Yeah, Margaret wasn't stupid, and she was a bright girl, but she wasn't, she wasn't that beautiful, and she wasn't that clever, but she was, she knew what she wanted, and she wasn't fooled by anyone. And so she said, when I have her say in the book, yes, I know all that. That's fine. That'll do. And she just goes away. So, and it happens, and that is what happens. And of course, there's no child of that marriage for at least 2 years. And
Right.
Joan says to the king, well, if there is a child before 2 years, we'll know that you've broken your word. That was Margaret, and that was how she had to handle things with the king.
And Joan's interaction with her is it's also interesting because she really was there.
She was, yes,
for all of it.
For the wedding, she actually was there and spoke to the king about it after the wedding, before the consummation. So now Mary also desperately wanted Joan to go to France when she was marrying the King of France, because her brother had really led her in for it. King Henry VIII was on the throne, and he wanted to make a peace treaty with France. And actually, it was really Wolsey who wanted to make the peace treaty, but Henry agreed to go along with it. And Joan was asked to do it, and she couldn't really refuse. So she went. I mean, she loved Mary. She thought she was a lovely girl, and she was very happy to be with her, but she didn't particularly want to carry on being a lady in waiting. She had other plans in her life, which are also in the book. So she goes.
Ooh, is that a hint so that we read the book, or are you going to tell us what those plans are?
I'll go into that if we have time.
Yes,
but not just now, because she goes to the king, and she, when after the marriage is consummated, she's absolutely heartbroken by the state of Mary, because the bed is. I don't go into it in that great amount of detail, and won't do here, but it was a mess, and it was a bloody mess, and she thought that the king had been, violent with her, and it turned out that because there had been storms in the Channel when Mary came across, and the wedding couldn't take place until she got there, obviously, and so it was all put off, and then it was all very quick. And then the consummation was also, happened unexpectedly, as it were, at the wrong time. And, she had got her period. And it wasn't a violent consummation at all. It was her period coming. So, and this had to be explained to the king, and it was all very difficult. And then it had to be explained that he couldn't go back and sleep with her the next night and the next night. And of course, he was desperate to get a child, and he didn't want to hold back in this way. He wanted to get an heir because he didn't have one. He only had 2 princesses. And he needed desperately to get a prince before he got too old. So, and he was 54 or something, so he was old. I mean, poor Mary was only 18. It was too big a gap, really. And he didn't like Joan for this very reason, because he blamed her for the fact that he couldn't do what he liked when she was there. She organised whatever she was doing. She organised. She was too bossy, in other words. And that didn't.
Yes. Well, good for her for stepping in, though. Yeah. I think that's a good time to speak up.
So we've done Mary and we've done Margaret. So that's the 2 princesses that she helped to get married. And then, of course, King Louis of France didn't last very long. I mean, he got married in, was it November? Or I think it was November by the time they got there. And he died in January. So he didn't get an heir, and he didn't get much, really.
Right. So then was Joan involved in Mary's marriage to Charles Brandon as well?
I don't think so. I certainly don't. I haven't read anything about her being involved in that. They were good friends, Mary, and Mary, she helped with all her trousseaux and her marriage things. But I'm not sure whether or not she approved of this marriage to Brandon. Certainly Henry didn't, and in fact it was a very naughty thing to do. Mary was a bit like that. She was, a bit naughty, and did the wrong thing and married this man, Henry Brandon, because she loved him. I mean, he was very. I don't know why she loved him, because I had seen the portraits. He didn't look terribly handsome to me, but still. He obviously had something that she wanted, and so she
must have been the charm.
Yes, and they were happily married. Whatever he was doing when he wasn't in the same house, but it was interesting. I don't think she had anything to do with that marriage.
Well, then before I move on to my next question from our listeners, I'm going to see if we can put you on the hot seat. Then you had mentioned just a couple minutes ago something about her plans. You hinted at that.
Yes, she had a plan because, it's going to give it away, but Sir Richard dies. I'm not going to say how or why, but he dies. And
okay, I won't ask any questions about that.
Leaves her
read
widow.
The book.
He was older than her, but I mean, he died. Leaves her a widow, and there is somebody else who loves her, who has fallen in love with her before Sir Richard dies, and she's known him for some time, and he is 16 years younger than her, and this is she finds this difficult, and she won't marry him, even when she says, "I won't marry you, even if you ask me." But in fact,
don't bother.
They do marry, and he's a lovely guy, and he's the man who tried to save Sir Richard from King Henry VII's nasty man, Dudley. Anyway, we won't go into that because that's somebody else's book.
That's okay. Now, just to make sure we're clear here, this is not the same person. I know in the beginning of our conversation, you had mentioned that she kind of chose between two men to marry, and she ended up choosing. It's not him, right?
No, he's not very nice. No, this is a charming and very nice and handsome young man called Anthony Hoynes.
Good for her. Good for Joan.
It's good for Joan. He has been one of Sir Richard's squires because every knight has a sort of cohort of squires who want to be knights themselves. And Anthony Hoynes has been, as from the age of 13, one of Sir Richard's squires. And he goes on to become a fight in a battle, and Joan actually does save his life by treating a wound that he gets. That's all covered in the book. So he has a great deal to be thankful to her for, and she doesn't think that's the case.
Cliffhanger.
She just says, no, this is ridiculous. So this all, but then eventually, when maybe a year or two after Sir Richard has died, she is looking after the princesses at Eltham, and he comes to see her. And his wife has also died. Now, he was married, so he couldn't actually get married until she died, which he did, having a child, which was very sad. But he didn't get on with her. She was not an easy woman, and this is all carried on in the book. So this gradually builds up to the time when he comes to Eltham Palace to see her. And she says, I don't want to see you, but he does see her. They do see each other, and they speak, and they end up going to bed. But it's all,
To put it mildly.
Yes, well, that's what happened, because in fact, they did love each other very much. And that so that eventually, she says to him, because he's a lawyer, she says, we must get married in a church quickly. And he said, excuse me, but in law, once a marriage is consummated, it's a marriage. So we are married, whether you want to get married or not. So she thought that was quite a good argument. And but they did get married in a church, in fact, after that. And that she was happy. She was violently happy with him. I mean, they were happy together. It was a very, very happy marriage. And that's the reason I know this is because Anthony Hoynes was the son of a beautiful lady called Lady Margaret, and she was the daughter of Anthony Woodville, who was one of Queen Elizabeth Woodville's brothers. She and the Woodvilles were all beautiful, and she was extremely beautiful. And her name was Margaret, another Margaret. And she lived with her husband, who in this lovely old house. This is just down the road from me, and it's a beautiful Tudor house in red brick. And I wanted to get it into my books, but it's just down the road from you where you live now. But,
oh my goodness!
But in fact, I wanted to get it into my books because it's a lovely house, and I hadn't realised that Anthony Hoynes had lived there, and he actually inherited it from his father when he died. And he and Joan spent their married life and in this house. So, and he is buried in the church in the nearby village. So, to me, that's a nice ending.
I agree. So, okay, now I'm happy that you said that she had been happy for all those years with her next husband, because my next question is actually, it is a serious one that she seems to have played somewhat of a large role in the king's great matter when it comes to King Henry VIII when he's looking for an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. But that is kind of a big jump in years. So before we go into her deposition, as far as the king's great matter goes, what has she been doing in between? Helping her two princesses get married and start their lives, and then all of a sudden we fast forward many years to Henry and his divorce. So is there anything happening where she's just kind of strolling along every day, super happy with this young guy she married, and there's no drama happening, so we don't have to hear anything?
No. She does lots of things. She is involved with Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon, as everybody knows, I'm sure, was married to Arthur, the first Prince of Wales, of Henry VII's eldest son, who sadly died very soon after they married. And she was left sort of dangling, really, not knowing nobody knew what to do with her much, and it was very difficult for her, and she had a very miserable time. But she eventually, through through Anthony Hoynes' father, who was her. What was his name? He had a title. He was one of her courtiers, high up in her court, and he organised all her finances and that sort of thing. Wasn't an easy job. This is before she married Henry VIII, and there were secret meetings going on between Henry and Catherine, which nobody knew about except him, and he told Joan about it and said he thought she would benefit from her friendship, and he wanted her to go and meet her and try and teach her some English, because she didn't really speak much English at all. So she did. She went and helped her with her English, and just generally tried to cheer her up a bit. And then, of course, she was cheered up when Prince Henry came across the river from his palace, where he was training his men for his big tournament, which he was to have as Prince of Wales. And so he's not married and he's not king yet. So but he does fancy Catherine. Eventually, of course, as everybody knows, they did marry. Yeah, that was fine. And after that, Joan retired and went away. But it was a nice sort of incident in her life that she had these meetings with Catherine of Aragon and made a friendship with her and taught her English.
So interesting to know that she played such a big role in Catherine's life. Joan really is one of those.
Catherine and Henry were first married at Greenwich Palace privately, and Catherine asked Joan if she would come and help her with her clothing, and she had a beautiful dress, and she got married in the chapel. But it wasn't a big royal wedding; it was just a quite a simple affair, if you can ever have a simple royal affair, with Henry VIII, which was about the simplest that he ever got. So he was young; he was only 18, and she was 21 or 2, and it was a nice marriage, and they were very much in love. I mean, it was a lovely marriage to start with, and Joan was part of that.
To start with, but then we come to Anne Boleyn's. I don't want to say her home wrecking, but kind of.
Yeah.
So now Joan makes the a deposition saying that Arthur and Catherine of Aragon did consummate their marriage.
Yes.
Right. So now why do you think that because if she was close with Catherine, do you think that she really believed this and she was just trying to tell the truth and help out? Do you think she felt pressure to say that from Henry?
Who are we talking about here, Anne?
Oh, Joan.
Joan. Well, Joan was in the household of Arthur when he and Catherine of Aragon married. But she wasn't in the intimate circle of, being in the room when they went to bed or anything like that. She was one of the ladies in waiting, and she helped Catherine with her things, but she didn't actually ever go into the marriage chamber. And so, she was, and she wasn't terribly fond of Anne Boleyn, I have to say. So she wasn't able to confirm anything about the marriage, and neither was her son, Henry. Henry, who was in one of King Henry VIII's, her son Hal, who she called Hal. Henry was in Henry VIII's household, and he wasn't closely involved either, because at the time, as he said in his answer to their questions, I was 12 and I didn't really know what was going on. So he got away with it, and she got away with it too. They didn't have to say anything in the end.
Okay, so then she did not come out and officially say that they had consummated it. Is that right?
No,
okay.
Not as far as I'm concerned. I don't think she could have done. I mean, because she wasn't there. She wasn't there when he walked out and said, "This night I have been in Spain," or whatever it was. So she didn't hear it. So she couldn't say that she had.
Well, that definitely clarifies that, because I think that was something that you can find. I mean, really, if you search the internet, right, you can find pretty much anything that you want. So, so that's actually very helpful
about it. But she didn't ever confirm that there was any consummation.
We are coming to a close, but I do want to talk about her death, because specifically, if you have heard kind of my talks before on the podcast, you'll know that I'm always partial to these women who might not necessarily be well known at the beginning of the conversation, but then by the end, she's had this, great life where she lived so long and has been involved in all these different affairs and different, and by affairs, I don't mean relationships. I mean, dramatic, situations. Yeah. And she actually, Joan in particular, was involved in all these different queens' lives and the king's lives. And she was a real solid figure in a lot of what was happening back then. So she ended up living to be 75. Does that sound right to you, Joanna?
78, I think.
78. Yeah. See, there you go. Which is, I mean, very unusual for the time.
It was, yes, it was. I mean,
so what did she die of?
Well, that we don't know. She had married Anthony Hoynes and was living in the Bristol area where his house is, and was. And she couldn't be the lady of the house because he died before her, funnily enough. I mean, I don't know what he died of either, but he died quite a few years before her. She then decided to enter this small, it's more or less like a hospice in Bristol itself. And that's eventually where she died. And, that's where she's buried.
And so she outlived him and her son. Yes. Is that correct?
Not her son. No, this is not her son. This is her husband, her second husband. She outlived.
Right. But her child, I think, she had one.
Yes,
one child.
She had Hal. Yes.
Was he still alive?
No, he died as well.
Oh, he died too. Right.
I'm not sure if he didn't die of the sweat or something. I didn't gather what he died of. It was a sudden death, I think. He was living in Leeds Castle. Oh, that's another story. We won't go into that.
There's just so much to cover. So much to cover.
They were so involved with this royal family and everybody around it that it's really interesting. Before she died, of course, this was in 1538. So we're talking about the whole Anne Boleyn thing, and also the Reformation and the closing of the monasteries. And she was living in this hospice, which was run by monks. And she wrote a letter to Henry, more or less begging him not to close down this hospice, please, because I'm here and I want to die here. Sort of more or less.
Oh, Joan.
Yeah. And he didn't. He did later.
Oh, he didn't. And that is just a great testament to what kind of a relationship she built with all of these people.
Well, what kind of
That's actually very interesting to hear.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we really could go on about her for hours and hours and hours, but this feels like a good time to wrap things up. But before I let you go, I know that we've mentioned the books already, but just to reiterate, the books about Joan are called The Lady of the Ravens is the first book, and then The Queen's Lady. Now, if any of our listeners have any more questions for you or want to interact with you, I do want to mention that Joanna is on Twitter. Can you let us know what your Twitter handle is?
Yes, it's at Joanna Hickson.
Perfect. Thank you, Joanna. Well, thank you so much to our guest today, Joanna Hickson. To our listeners who wrote in with questions, we could not do it without you. And to everyone listening to this week's episode, as always, we appreciate your support and hope you'll tune in again next time as we continue to ask our experts the pressing questions that you want answered. And if you love the Tudors Dynasty podcast and want to show even more support, please consider becoming a patron, where you'll not only receive the great content we offer now, but extra insider research, info, prizes, and other exciting opportunities only offered by subscribing. Until next time, I'm Steph Storer. Thanks for listening.